Viceland has produced a documentary series called Dark Side of the Ring, which is about several different events that have happened in the professional wrestling business. And the first episode is called The Match Made in Heaven, and this will be about Macho Man Randy Savage and Miss Elizabeth. So the documentary starts and we see Bruce Pritchard talking. Then we see Jake the Snake Roberts, we see Eric Bischoff, we see Linda Hogan, and it's worth noting that Hulk Hogan decided to give this documentary a 5 out of 10, and he criticized it on Twitter, and he was also unhappy about the sources. I'm sure he was referencing Linda. And then Viceland, they replied to Hogan and they said, you were asked to be on this documentary and you declined, which is really funny, just kind of putting Hogan in his place there. And Hogan, for this documentary, I'm sure in Viceland, their first guy they wanted to interview was Hulk Hogan, who would be closer related to Macho Man Randy Savage and Miss Elizabeth in the 80s, and Hulk Hogan, especially because of how big of a name he is. He'd be the first guy they'd go to. Are you crazy? So I'm sure he's just pissed off Linda's on this. And from what I've heard, Linda Hogan is all over this documentary. And I think the guy who's going to narrate this, if I can recognize this voice, is Dirty Dutch Mantel, also known as Zeb Coulter when he was in the WWE, but we're going to call him Dutch. You have Bruce Pritchard talking about Randy Savage's upbringing, his father, Angelo Poffo, and he ran kind of a rebellious wrestling federation when he was a promoter. It looks like we're going to get a lot of Lanny Poffo on this documentary, which I'm not looking forward to. See some stupid poems or some shit like that. So we see Linda Balea for the first time, and I'm sure she's going to tell a lot of stories about Randy Savage and Miss Elizabeth. And from what I know, they played a huge part in their divorce, because Savage used to hate Hogan because he blamed him for his divorce. If you don't know the story, from what I know, Hogan and Linda, I guess you just call them Terry and Linda Balea, at the time, they were supporting Elizabeth, and we all know the stories of Savage or Poffo being very overprotective, being very controlling of Elizabeth. I'm sure that's what led to their divorce. We see Jimmy Hart as a part of this documentary. We also see Scott Hall on this. So they briefly go how they talk about how they met. They talk about when Liz first debuted with Randy Savage. And right now, things are good, and eventually things are going to get very tragic. So the whole idea with them is Randy is very verbally abusive to Liz. He gives her those eyes when he opens up his eyes, yelling at her. He was just such an asshole. The whole idea is to get the audience to get behind Elizabeth and want her to leave Randy. That's the whole storyline. And it's done really well. Savage, the thing about Savage and Liz, it's one of those things, to wrestling fans in the 80s, they're wrestling's Romeo and Juliet. They're the ultimate power couple in the history of wrestling. You think of professional wrestling, if you ever think of a couple, no one ever comes before Randy Macho Man Savage and Miss Elizabeth. But originally, really back in the mid-80s, the whole idea was for Elizabeth to finally see the light and get away from her abusive boyfriend, the Macho Man. They talk about Wrestlemania 3, Randy Savage against Ricky the Dragon Steamboat, and Lanny Poffo. He basically says that match kind of killed Randy because he could never top it. Savage slowly becomes, actually post Wrestlemania 3, he slowly becomes a fan favorite, even though he was a heel, and the fans organically get really behind him. And eventually he becomes the second biggest star in the company, and Vince McMahon decides to ally the two biggest stars as the Mega Powers, Hulk Hogan and the Macho Man Randy Savage. The Mega Powers managed by Miss Elizabeth. And this is where Savage eventually becomes a top guy. They actually skip over WrestleMania 4. That's where Savage won the belt. They go right to SummerSlam 88, which is a very memorable show. Who can forget Miss Elizabeth taking off her dress and revealing her bra and panties underneath? One of the most memorable moments in wrestling at the time. And eventually they get to Savage and Hogan feuding. WrestleMania 5, the Mega Powers Explode, which at the time was the biggest event for the WWF in their history. It sold more pay-per-views than they never had, and Hogan and Savage was built up for over a year. Probably the best built-up storyline still in the company of the history, because that was the two biggest stars in the company. And for over a year, they built it up, and it was just a great story, and it culminated in a great way. The two biggest stars wrestling on the biggest stage. Watching this documentary just makes me think of stuff that I already know. Everyone knows how controlling Savage was over Elizabeth. They keep going back to that. It's like, we all know this. If you're a wrestling fan, you're going to know all of this. So this isn't really too interesting for me right now. I think it'll get really sad once they get to the end of their lives. But for me, it's like, if you're not a wrestling fan, if you're a non-fan or maybe even a casual fan, you find this interesting. But if you're a hardcore fan, everyone in their right mind knows, of course, Macho Man Randy Savage was very controlling over Miss Elizabeth. So we see how much of a toll the business is taking on Elizabeth, and eventually she asks for time off. And at that time, this is probably during WrestleMania 6, this is where I think they put Savage with Sensational Sherry, and he becomes the Macho King. They actually skip over WrestleMania 6. Now I was thinking to myself, look at the transition of the Macho Man's WrestleMania matches. WrestleMania 3, he has the greatest match in WrestleMania history at the time when he wrestled Ricky the Dragon Steamboat for the Intercontinental title. WrestleMania 4, he wrestles 4 matches and he wins the main event. He wins the WWF Championship for the first time in the main event against the $1 Million Man Ted DiBiase. WrestleMania 5, it's the biggest match in the history of the company, sells more pay-per-views than ever, as he headlines WrestleMania 5 when he faces Hulk Hogan. So 3 huge WrestleMania spots. WrestleMania 6, it's a mixed tag match. It's the Macho King and Sensational Sherry against Polka Dots, Dusty Rhodes, and I don't even remember his female accomplice at the time. But man, that was a horrible match. That was sad to watch. But then we go to WrestleMania 7, and one of the most underrated matches in WrestleMania history. It was a retirement match. Randy Savage against the Ultimate Warrior. A classic match. I love this match. I think it's still the best match Warriors ever had. Even though the match with Hogan the year before is far more iconic than the match at 7. I thought as an actual match, I personally like this match even more. I really love that Warrior Savage match at WrestleMania 7. Loved it, and of course the ending is what makes it very memorable. Once we see the moment, after the match is over, Warrior beats Savage, his career's over, and then you have Sherry, who's just kicking him. She's furious, she's beating up Savage after he's went through a war against Warrior, and then all of a sudden, Miss Elizabeth can't take it anymore. She comes up through the crowd, she beats up Sherry, throws her out of the ring, and then she starts to cry. She looks at Savage, Savage looks at her, he does his crazy face, the crowd's slowly applauding. It's a great segment, and eventually they hug, Savage puts her on her shoulders, an amazing moment. You see grown men and women crying, just an amazing wrestling moment. Even if you hate romantic storylines, if you look at that, that's hard not to have that not bring a tear to your eye. That was just an incredible moment. One of my favorite WrestleMania moments of all time between Savage and Elizabeth. Who can forget that? That was just great, and really, really just incredible, just really amazing. Then later that year in 91, the reason they did the retirement match is because they both wanted some time off. Eventually they both come back in 91, and they Savage proposes to Elizabeth, and at SummerSlam is when they get married. Now we're getting to one of the most disturbing storylines of all time. That was Randy Savage and Jake the Snake Roberts. Savage crashes the reception ceremony. He leaves a giant cobra and a present. This was a very disturbing storyline. It's disappointing they never had a match to pay it off at WrestleMania 8. They went with Savage and Flair, but whenever I think of WrestleMania 8, that really should have been Savage and Jake the Snake Roberts, and the loser leaves town, because Jake the Snake, he actually lost to The Undertaker early in that show, and that really should have been Savage and Roberts, and then loser leaves town and Savage wins, which he beat him on main event. That writes off Jake Roberts in the main event, of course, of WrestleMania 8. Everyone knows it. It should have been Hulk Hogan and Ric Flair for the title. What an evil motherfucking heel Jake Roberts was. Just an evil guy. The stuff when he puts the snake on Savage and it doesn't let go. And of course it's gimmicked, but that is very disturbing to watch, even in 2019. You look back, that's just so fucking disturbing. And then him hitting Elizabeth, what an evil guy. I really wish they would have done something where, like, the last match, Savage eventually kicks ass. He does. You think he beats him on main event or something, but it really wasn't the best payoff. They really wanted to see you. They wanted you to see Savage destroy Roberts, and they didn't really give us that great of a payoff for that. So when they break up, one of the big reasons is they say Miss Elizabeth wants away from Randy Savage, and what she does is when Hulk Hogan's filming a movie, they were all living in Tampa. When Hogan's filming a movie, he has to stay in Miami, and he's staying with Linda, and Elizabeth goes with them, and she stays with Hogan and his wife, and they're home in Miami to get away from Savage, and of course it leads to them breaking up. So there's that crazy story in Miami, and eventually that leads to them separating, and they go their own ways. So they quickly leave this, and they go to Randy Savage leaving the companies with WCW. And they show Bruce Pritchard talking about how he had a meeting with Vince and a few other executives in the company in a car, and that was like, we never really got to know what's between Randy Savage and Vince McMahon. We all know the rumor about Stephanie. I don't know. Part of me thinks Vince McMahon has made up with everyone. Everyone, including Warrior, Hogan a whole bunch of times, Bret Hart, Bruno Sammartino, virtually everyone who he's had a falling out with, he's made up with, except Randy Savage. What happened? What's between them? If you sleep with a man's daughter while she's underage, you're going to want to kill this motherfucker. If that's what happened, I can understand it. Because part of me thinks, you know what, I think it's that. Because what else could it be? What else could Randy Savage have done to Vince McMahon for Vince wanted to spite him until the day he died? What could it be? I think it could be that. So they eventually go to WCW together. Randy gets her in, and this is where Elizabeth starts to date Lex Luger. So it's obviously a tragic situation. The two of them are both on drugs, are both pilled up. Eric Bischoff was talking a lot about this, and he even had a podcast. Before he did the whole 83 weeks with Conrad Thompson, he had his own podcast. And he interviewed wrestlers. And one of his interviews, he did this back in 2017, was with Lex Luger. And this was a good interview. He was pretty honest. And Luger is someone who, he really should be in the Hall of Fame, but he's not because of what happened to Elizabeth. Most wrestling fans blame him for her death, and which is true. However, I really want to talk about this. The WWE produced this documentary called WWE Confidential. And the person who they'd have narrate this, or actually host this rather, was Mean Gene Okerlund. And in this documentary, WWE basically paints the picture that Lex Luger killed Miss Elizabeth, which is bullshit. He's responsible for her death because of all the drugs, but to say that he murdered her, that was pretty disgusting. And I think that's always been a huge resentment factor. That's a very just horrible episode, to be honest. I kind of figured once we get to their death, the documentary's going to get really intriguing, and that's what happens. Yeah, it's really sad. I remember hearing when Miss Elizabeth died, it was just really sad. I was young at the time, and I had seen the old VHS tapes. That's what you had at the time of Randy Savage and Miss Elizabeth. I was just really just shocked. Oh, Miss Elizabeth died. That's just horrible. And they even show a video of Randy Savage being interviewed back in 2003 when Elizabeth dies, and it's almost like no emotion. It's tough to even watch. Lanny Poffo talks about when Randy gets married for a second time in 2010 to a woman who I think was actually his high school sweetheart, and he would unfortunately pass away a year later. So they talk about Savage passing away. He, in 2011, he was with his wife at the time, and he has a heart attack while they're driving. He loses control, and he smashes into a tree. He dies. Lanny Poffo even visits the site of the crash in the documentary where the tree is where Savage crashed into. And Savage, to talk more about his death, I remember hearing about it and just being totally stunned, absolutely shocked. Just couldn't believe it. WWE even produced one of the best tribute videos ever, still my favorite. It has Coldplay, The Scientist, the music playing, just very sad. And unfortunately, the documentary, it ends. It's I really wish WWE would have more of a role in this documentary. I thought it could have been even better, but I really enjoyed it. Thought it was really good narration. Eric Bischoff in particular did a very good job here, and it's pretty emotional near the end. And I thought it was a very good documentary. And even though Macho Man, Randy Savage, and Miss Elizabeth have passed away, they left the greatest love story in the history of professional wrestling.